What are you asking for specifically?
Yeah, go ahead.
We specifically are asking for an immediate meeting with the new Minister of Child and Family Services to bring these issues to the forefront with respect to the broader question of devolution and the systemic and fundamental problems that are arising very consistently, not just in the South but in the North as well, amongst our authorities and the actions. There's a new funding model that's being implemented as we speak. There are business plans around how to deliver child and family services within our communities, and we believe this to be an example of the commodification of our children. Our children are being commodified and becoming items of exchange for jobs and for funding coming out of provincial and federal coffers, and we need to address this issue. We want to sit with the minister. We want to make our introduction because we don't even know this new minister yet. We don't know what her intentions are. There's problems with the Hughes inquiry, obviously. This stalling tactic causes us to raise our concerns about what is it exactly that they're trying to hide from. If they're saying that the jurisdiction is beyond the Commission's jurisdiction, then what is the Commissioner's jurisdiction, and why are they trying to narrow the scope of the inquiry? Those are issues that we're trying to address specifically.
Chief Nepinak, just by hearing what you said earlier, with members of the MGEU, are you saying that there's some way to a compromise where the inquiry can go forward without having to stall it, or to go through this situation? Is that, like, is there a way in your mind, is there some sort of compromise to be reached so that maybe it could go forward without having to go through this challenge?
If the terms of reference for the Commissioner have been drafted in a way that raises questions of legality or jurisdiction, then I think there's a possibility that if all three parties come to the table, if Manitoba First Nations come to the table with the Union and with the province and figure out what are the appropriate terms of reference, what is the scope of the Commission, with particular emphasis on the broad and wide-scale problems with devolution, then perhaps we can settle this fairly quickly and get back into the inquiry, and hopefully lead to recommendations that can be implemented to help save children's lives.
Well, with the MGEU, first of all, saying they didn't want any names or identities published or faces, and now they're saying they question the inquiry altogether. It doesn't sound very likely that they're going to come and be cooperative on this. They don't want this, apparently.
I'm going to say that the truth needs to prevail, and if we're looking at anything, especially in the areas of devolution, and the question that was earlier asked to find a compromise, we cannot compromise our children any longer. We cannot compromise the fate of our communities any longer. The leaders are upset, the families are upset, moreover than the leaders are. And I feel that there will be a people movement if the authorities are not going to listen to our leadership. I definitely feel that there is going to be a people movement based on all the issues that are coming out of province and out of federal government today. So I do believe that the people are fed up just as much as the leaders are. We're being pushed into a corner too by some of our people who have jumped through the hoops and trying to get their children back, but are being told that they cannot have their children back. And again, when we go back to the days of residential school where children or our parents and our grandparents were forced into these institutions, that is exactly what's happening today. And again, I refuse to use that word compromise. We will not compromise our children anymore, or any less than it has been already.
When you got that letter, it was Friday, I think, what was the reaction because of all the delays? What would you decide another motion put forward?
Well, to me, it was frustration, and what we want to see is the truth come out of this inquiry, so that these things don't have to happen again within our communities or any other community. And we feel that by bringing everyone to the table, clearly defining roles and authorities as to what happened, it's not to really trying to find a place of blame, but to make sure to find out and point to the mistakes that were made, so that those mistakes never have to happen within any of our societies.
Why do you think they've waited so long?
If I might, I'd also like to add a bit of a response to that. My initial reaction was one of frustration when I received notice of this motion that's going before the Court of Appeal. I too feel that, constantly communities, First Nations chiefs across Canada are being held to account. There's always discussions about what kind of accountability is there for First Nations people. Now, what we're faced with here is we're faced with laws and rules that are being implemented so that nobody has to be accountable for their actions when dealing with our children. Now, that to me is a paradox when one component of our society talks so much about accountability for First Nations people, but yet won't even be accountable for their own actions in dealing with our children, and build ways and laws and processes to avoid that. That is very frustrating, and that's very disheartening. We're constantly being, as First Nations chiefs, being demonized and vilified in the newspaper for our actions, and yet here's a prime example of a stalling tactic that is only going to slow down and delay the important recommendations that are going to come out of the Hughes inquiry that could lead to better protection. It could lead to saving children's lives. And we're only delaying those recommendations by getting involved in stuff like this. And it's very disappointing. Very disappointing.
So why do you think they've waited so long? I mean, this has been going on for a long time now. In your opinion?
In my opinion, there are many rules and procedures and court processes that could be activated in any particular time in a process this sensitive in order to delay processes and delay proceedings, based on someone else's priorities. And I think this is a prime example.
What is it that you're asking Jennifer Howard, not in terms of the whole devolution issue, but just in terms of this inquiry? What are you going to the table asking for?
I think what we're going to go to the table and ask for is for participation in a reconsideration of the terms of reference, respecting the scope of the inquiry, and like I mentioned before, making sure that some of the systemic problems and some of the systemic failures of devolution are brought into the scope of the inquiry.
And you haven't heard back, right? That's correct.
That was only done on Friday, so that's when we probably fix this.
Thank you. Would you care to comment on what you see as the systemic failures of the devolution?
Well, let's start with in excess of 10,000 children in care. How's that for a systemic failure? Let's talk about, for example, the amount of children who are coming out of their homes and never going back until they're of age. Let's talk about the kids who are losing their languages. Let's talk about the kids who are losing their access to culture. Talk about the kids who are losing access to the traditions and the protocols of our people, the stories of our people. The ceremonies are being lost as these children are being taken out of their communities and put into foster care or a system that makes no room for Indigenous culture here in our society. That is a systemic failure. Let's talk about the diversion of federal dollars into provincial coffers so that the system can continue to be funded. That's a failure. Let's talk about the fact that a chief can't sit in his office. He or she cannot sit in their office and talk to community grandmothers about their children for fear of politically interfering in a CFS matter. That's a failure. We could go on extensively, but I think that captures what you're asking.
And when you do talk about devolution, you need all the parties sitting at the table. I mean, I can't tell you how to run your office and how to do the news. If I tell you, then you're not getting the true picture out there. And that's exactly what's happening to our people and our leaders. They want to talk about the devolution process. They want to be involved. We want to use our grandmothers, like the Grand Chief had said. We want to use the life givers of our communities to help set the terms of references on how this whole organization and how this whole CFS system can work. But what does the federal government do as well? Even in their immigration papers, when immigrants come to our country, they're not totally in the education process about learning about the treaties on how this country derived to what it is today. And instead, in the immigration papers, they're also told, if you can't find work, maybe you would consider adopting one of the Aboriginal children here in this territory. And you check that in the immigration papers. That's exactly what it says.
Use the number 10,000, that's Manitoba alone.
Yes.
Those are your figures, or?
Those are part of my fact sheet that have been provided by, that's been professionally and legally.
Do you have a comparison for that? I mean, what year was that, 2010 numbers versus how that's kind of 20,000?
It seems to have kind of hit a threshold point, and I can't say for sure what it's at. I think it might be just under now, but I think it was in 2010 it went over. So, the numbers they fluctuate, but I think it's important to note that in some First Nations communities, upwards of 50% of the children are in care. And the other 50% of children are wondering where their siblings are. When we talk about failures and we talk about challenges, these are just some small examples. We're faced with a situation right now in the north where the government of Manitoba is attempting to take over the funding structures, to co-manage or to bring in some type of advice on how to manage the money, because we're not towing the line with them. This was supposed to be about empowerment of families. It's supposed to be about providing mechanisms of healing for people and families and communities so that our households will become strong again. And instead we've gone completely the opposite direction. We have further entrenched institutionalization in our communities and in our households. And this has got to stop.
So you're saying you want you want to make sure that I've got this right. You're saying you want the inquiry to be broadened. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's correct, Louise. Any other questions?
More questions?
Just one more thing. What I would like to add is why don't you do a public interest story on one of these families that have been made to jump through the hoops and can't get anywhere with it? Because we have families that are some that have committed suicide because they can't get anywhere. They can't get their families back together, and that's their breaking point. That they can't even return to society, that they have to take their own lives, and that's what I'm asking the media. Why don't you go out there? We have a lot of names, and we take in a lot of complaints, at least 2 to 4 a week here at SCO, of grandmothers, of mothers, of parents that have gone through the system and are fighting for their kids back and have nowhere to turn, and have told us and have shared with us everything that they needed to do to get their child back, but they are not getting them back. Why don't you guys do a public interest story on some of those children to prove and show the province exactly what they're doing? We try and get these stories out there, and nobody wants to print them. Nobody wants to print them. I don't know if it's protecting the union. I don't know who they're protecting. But we try and get these stories out there, and nobody is running with them. But meanwhile, there's parents angry that are not getting their children back. Parents, again, that are suicidal, or that even phone us and tell us, if I can't get any action, this is what I want to do. And we try and talk them out of it and tell them, look, we know you're at your bottom end, but we really need to sit with you and try and find a positive path to try and help you get your children back. And then they go on to tell us, well, we jumped through every single hoop that we've been told to jump through. We're sober, we're drug-free, we've gotten jobs. One grandmother had called last week because she's working, and her grandson is upset in school. Then the school did the test. If he was ADHD or ADD, he wasn't, but they still gave him a form of Ritalin anyway. And they took the child out of the grandparents' home, and they told the grandmother, you're too busy, you can't look after your child. So what are they taking our children now because we're working? Where's the happy medium here? First of all, they're taking them because we're not working, and now they're taking them because we are working. What gives? Something's got to give. And it's certainly not us that are going to give, especially those families on those communities, because they're already talking differently than what the leadership is. Because as leaders, we're trying very hard to get to that provincial table to tell the province what the people want, what our constituents want, but it's falling on deaf ears, and the situation is getting worse. We're losing more children, and our people are getting more upset.
Big Rich.